This is a brief tutorial of how to add line and curve labels in Civil 3D, specifically in this example to property boundaries and easements, and we're just going to use the type of formatting that you will traditionally see in a plat document. It doesn't mean this is always going to be the way it's done or the way that your company might prefer it, but this is what you'll see a lot of times in plat documents and something that looks clean and concise. So to add labels to our lines and curves, we're going to go from the Home tab over to the Annotate tab. We have our Add Labels button in the top left. We're going to click the drop down and go down here almost to the bottom to Line and Curve, and over to our top option, Add Line and Curve Labels. That's going to pop up this window. Now we can set what label style we would like to use as our default. I'm going to just keep it as standard for both for now. And I'm going to click the Add Labels button. Now it's asking me to select a point on an entity, so I'm just going to go around and click on all of the lines and the curves that I want to be labeled. And I'm going to use the midpoint snap when I do this because a lot of times it's nice to have the text centered on the line. It just gives a nice clean look. So I'm going to go around and label all of my property boundaries. In this example, the white lines are meant to represent property boundaries and the red dashed lines are easements. Just drawn hypothetically for an example here. So I've labeled all of my property boundary lines for Lot 1 and Lot 2. I like typically to keep the text for the property boundary labels on the outside of the property boundary. What this allows you to do, if I keep this text on the outside of this line, is this label is for this entire line. I can then come in behind it and label on the inside or below the line this segment length, the segment length of my easement here, and then this segment length. So I like to have all of my text on one side of the line. How do I do that? I need to edit my standard line label style. To do that, we're going to go back to the Home tab and we're going to open Tool Space. I'm going to put this little menu off to the side here. And in Tool Space, I'm going to select my standard line label style, which is what these labels have been placed on. I'm going to right click and edit it. We've opened up to the General tab. I'm going to move over to the Layout tab, and you'll notice that this label has three components: a table tag, a bearing, and a distance. The table tag is not printing. All that we're seeing on our screen is the bearing and the distance. The easiest way for me with the way this style is set up to get all of, because I want the bearing and the distance on the same side of the line together, I can do it. I'm going to do it manually just to show you the long way, but it's probably not the fastest way. I'm editing my distance component. My anchor component is the feature. And my attachment is top center. I'm going to change the attachment to bottom center. And when I hit apply, it's now moved up above the line, but it's stuck within this text. So that actually isn't going to work for us because I have two components now that I have to try to keep offset from each other and not overlapping each other. And they're individual components and they aren't aware of each other's length. So I'm going to go back to top center the way we had it, scrap that idea, and instead I'm just going to change the visibility to be false. So now the distance is printing. Now I can go to my bearing component. I select the contents. I click on this ellipses at the end of the label, and it pops open this text component editor. I'm going to add a space from the end of this component. This component is the general segment direction in the format of degrees, minutes, seconds, and it's reading the bearing off of the line. I'm going to add a space, and then I'm going to choose a different component, the general segment length. I'm going to set my precision to be 2 decimal points, and I'm going to add that to this label. Now if I hit OK and apply my changes, I have bearing and distance on the same side of the line, as you can see, because I've just overridden my bearing component to contain both the bearing and distance. And I set my distance component to have a false visibility so that it doesn't print. If you are, for instance, making a copy of a line label style because you need a new style, to edit the name, that would be in the Information tab. You can change the default layer in the General tab, and there's some other options that you can play around with, but that's the basics. One other thing that I'm going to do is change the text height to 0.08. Just out of preference, that's what I like to use in my drawings. It prints pretty well on 24 by 36 sheets. Everything looks good now. I'm going to hit OK. We've finished editing the line style. And the only other thing that I'm going to come in and do is I'm going to select these two line labels, and in my properties I'm going to flip them. That way, relative to lot 1, this text is on the outside of the property boundary. I like that here, but in the instance of this easement, it's kind of creating a conflict and an overlap, so maybe I'll flip this one back to the inside after thinking about it for another couple of seconds. My curve label style now. I could create a style that has all of the different components of my curve shown here in CAD, but typically for a plat document, especially if there are more curves than just one, like I have in this example, typically you're going to have a lot more than that. It's not going to be all straight lines. We like to just do a curve table. That's just simpler. If that's what I'm going to do, then I select my curve label and I come over to the style, and I change my curve label style from standard to table tag, and now I get this tag which can be added to a curve table, which shows the bearing and distance of all of your curves together. That's pretty simple. All my other labels are centered. They're on the outside of my property boundary. They look nice. Now I'm going to come in and add labels to my easement lines. To do that, we still have our Add Labels widget open. So I'm going to select Table Tag as my default label styles. Hit the Add button again, and I'm going to come in and select all of the segments of my easement. And I'm using my midpoint snap just so they're nice and centered and they look clean. It's the little things that make the difference. Now, you'll notice with the way that this table tag line label style is set up, if I change the layer to my text layer, which is something I forgot to do with my property boundary labels. So I'm going to grab all of them real quickly, doing select similar. I'm going to weed out the ones that I just added for the easements. I'm going to slap these on my text layer. And they all turn yellow because they're by layer in the settings. Now you'll notice if I change the layer of this easement label style, the color didn't change. We didn't get any change there. If I try to override the color, again, we didn't get any change. So something is wrong with that style. To fix it, I'm going to go back to Tool Space. I'm going to edit my line label style, which in this case is table tag. The table tag component is the one we want to edit. And I'm going to have a quick peek in the contents to see if perhaps in the Format tab they have been overridden to a color, but they haven't. They're set to by block, which is okay. I like that. So something else is causing this problem. If I go to the General tab, I see that the layer has been set to def points. I'm going to bump it back to 0, and now if I hit Apply and close my style editor, now if I change the layer of this label, the color changes with it. The color reflects the label, and if I want to override it, because the text was set to by block, I'm having a little bit of an issue doing that. So I'm going to go, in this case, back to my style and edit it again, because I would like for these labels, the 7 that I added to my easement, to be on my text layer, but I'd like them to be overridden to a color of red, because I don't need them to be as bold and as dark as my property boundary labels. And in the plot style that I use, red is going to be a lighter and a thinner color than yellow. So I've selected all of these and I've overridden them to red, but they're not changing. So I'm going to go back into my style and edit it. I'm going to go to my table tag and edit my components. Select everything that is in there and go to the Format tab. It's set to by block, which is what should allow me to override the color in the drawing. If something is set to by layer, then you have to change the layer to change the color of it. You cannot manually override the color, but if it's set to by block, you're supposed to be able to manually override the color, but it's not working here, so we need to do a little bit of diagnosing. If I go further out in my text properties, I find here that we're set to by layer, and I bet if I set us to by block in these two places, not important to my border because my border visibility is set to false. You can see if I set it to true, you can get some type of a border should you want that for your line label style, but it's set to false. But anyway, I've set my text to by block. I'm going to hit apply, and I'm just going to drag this out of the way and peek, and sure enough, they've all become red because I'd already overridden them in the drawing to be red. So fantastic, that's great. The other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to drop my text height down to 0.08 because, as you can see, these are a much bigger text style than my property boundaries, which is certainly not what I want. I want these to pop. I want my property boundary labels to really pop, and then I just want this information to be available on the sheet. So I've changed the text height to 0.08. They're supposed to match now, and if I hit apply, it looks like, sure enough, they pretty well match. I'm just going to double check that the text height hadn't been overridden in any way in format, and it is not. So I'm going to hit OK. Close everything out. And now I'm going to flip this curve label to the outside. I kind of missed that because, again, I'd like it to be on the outside of my property boundary. The last thing that we need to do is we need to label the distance from this property boundary to the easement line, across the easement, and then from this easement line to the end of this property line and the start of the new one. We're going to do that on the inside or above the property line. That's why we put this on the outside. The easiest way to do this, if everything is lines, is to use a dimension style. I'm going to use my endpoint snap and go endpoint to endpoint here. And I'm just going to drop it on the line. Now, these don't look anything like what we want them to, but that's okay. We can make a new dimension style. If we go up here to our dimension styles and click this bottom arrow to expand it out, we see that we have only one style. So I'm going to go ahead and hit new. I'm going to change my name to No Arrows because I don't need this line or the arrows, I just want the text. Start with standard as my copy. I'm going to set it to annotative, hit continue, and now I'm going to go ahead and I'm editing my lines here, and I'm going to go ahead and hit suppress on both dimension line 1 and dimension line 2. Don't need to see those. And I'm going to go ahead and hit suppress on extension line 1 and extension line 2. Then I'm going to go over to my symbols and arrows tab. None of these are showing up because I've suppressed my dimension lines, so that's not really an issue. I'm I'm going to go over to my text tab, drop the text size down to 0.08, and I'm going to change the offset from the dimension line to be 0.03. So the text comes in a little bit tighter. Text alignment is already set to be aligned with the dimension line as opposed to always being aligned horizontal. That's what I want. I'm going to go over to my fit, take a look, see if anything jumps out at me that doesn't look right. I don't really see anything there, so we're okay. Precision is set to 2 decimal places, which is what we want. And for our suffix, we have an apostrophe in there for our feet, our units of feet. We're set to suppress leading zeros, which is good. And that's about it. I'm going to hit OK. Go ahead and close. I'm going to go ahead and set standard to current, just in case, because when I start labeling other things in the drawing, that is still what I want as my style. I'm going to go ahead and grab these 3 dimensions that I've made. I'm going to change the dimension style in my properties to no arrows. And the text drops down to 0.08. And the annotative, they are annotative and set to 1 to 20, which is our current scale. So those look nice. Now the reason that I did not use a table tag for this distance across the easement is because I'm not labeling an easement, I'm labeling a portion of the property boundary. Now I'm noticing that this text height is not the same as for my property boundary label, so that means I've got an issue with this style because I know I've just set both of these to 0.08, so I'm fairly confident that they're showing up correctly and that the issue lies with my bearing and distance label being too small. So I'm going to jump back into Prospector real quick. Again, we go to General, Label Styles, Line, Standard, right-click and edit. We're in the Layout tab. We're going to jump to our bearing component, which is the one that holds our text. And sure enough, I forgot to set the text height to 0.08. Pretty simple fix. Apply. Okay, boom. Now everything looks right. I'm going to do the same thing on my curve table tag real quick. Just double check that I've got it set to 0.08, and I do, so we're good there. And sure enough, it looks right out there. So I've labeled these 3 components of my property boundary. The other place that I would do that is here. Let me go ahead and show you. Again, I'm going to use my endpoint snap. Just drop these dimensions in right on the line. And now I'm going to grab these 2 dimensions that I just made, change the style to no arrows, and I'm going to go ahead and go down to my text component. Scroll a little too far there. Here we go. My text component and text position vertically, I'm going to change that to below. And that looks about right. So that's why we put our bearing and distance label on the outside of the property boundary so that we can come in and label the smaller segments on the inside. And the reason these are just labeled with distance is because we're just labeling portions of this line that has a bearing of north at 0 degrees east. So it's the same. It's all the same line. It's the same bearing. We don't need that information repeated. We're just labeling the interior segments of it, and you see that sure enough they add up to 100. I've got to do the same thing one more time along this side, and then we're pretty much done. Again, I'm going to drop in my 3 multi-liters. I'm sorry, not multi-liters, dimensions. Little brain fog there. I'm going to grab all 3 of those. If I hit select similar, I get all of them, not just the ones in my style, so I'm going to have to select them manually, which is okay. Grab all 3 of those, change my style to no arrows, and again I'm going to go down to my text and set the vertical position to be below instead of above the line. And there we go. I've got my outer property boundary labeled. The only other thing that I'm going to do is grab these. They're on my text layer, but I'm going to bump them to red, the same as my table tags, so that my property boundary labels, my bearing and distance labels for the outside of my property boundary really pop, and everything else is a little lighter because on my plot style, red is lighter than yellow. So that's a pretty quick rundown of how you do that. That's similar to what you'll see on a lot of plat documents, but again, everybody's got a little bit of a different way of doing it, but that's how you manipulate some of those styles and how you add them to a drawing.